You should start a podcast. You should start a podcast. You should start a podcast. No, you should start a podcast. Everybody should start a podcast. But should they really? No, not everybody should start a podcast. I know there are people who are way higher than me and making so much more money than me saying you should start a podcast. But here's the reality of starting a podcast. It takes a lot of time and it can be very frustrating. Those are the two biggest reasons why you should really think through whether or not you should start a podcast. Would you randomly just go out and say, I'm going to do this for my business without giving it any thought? I'm going to go out and do this with my business without giving any consideration to the amount of time it's going to take to actually make that thing happen? Or look at the impact it's going to have on your revenue and your resources and the opportunity cost of giving something else up in order to focus on a podcast. So in today's episode, I'm going to go through 3 reasons why you should actually think through starting a podcast before just jumping in. So let's get to it. Hi there, I'm Vicki. I know your Plateau to Grow marketer, and today I'm going to go through 3 things that I think are extremely important in understanding before you just dive right in and start your own podcast. Now, I know there are people everywhere, different industries, different income levels, different influences that are saying you should start a podcast. I'm going to go through the reality of it, and it's going to be a no fluff, no jargon, no holds bar on the reality of starting a podcast. And the reason why I'm sharing this with you, one, I'm going to be completely transparent. My podcast is not up there getting tens and thousands of views with every single episode. I'm probably on the lower to mid end of the number of downloads, and I just want to create the reality of what you're getting into when you start a podcast. Now, it's going to depend on so many different factors. So I'm going to review some things I would change that might have impacted the numbers I'm getting in my podcast if I had done these things at the beginning. So let's go ahead and get started. Okay, the first thing that I recommend that you think through before jumping in and starting a podcast for your business is, does it make sense for your business model, and is your target audience going to listen to it? If you think of the time that we're in right now, which is, we're still COVID era, right? It's September 2020, almost October 2020. And the reality is people just aren't spending as much time in their cars. And when you have a podcast, generally people were listening to podcasts on their way to and from work or to and from meetings, or a lot of time was being spent in their cars. So that was a logical time to invest in catching up on all these different podcasts. During that same time, everybody else was too busy on other things to create their own podcast. So when the lockdown hit from COVID, all of a sudden everybody wanted to start creating their own podcasts. So I'll jump into that in item number 2, so stick with me. But when you think of your business and what makes sense, deciding to start a podcast is going to require the same thought process that you would go through to launch a new product, to bring on a business partner, to start a new position and hire someone for it. If you should change any type of software or applications that you're using to increase the efficiency in your business. Yes, starting a podcast can be super easy and it doesn't have to be time consuming. But when you make the decision to start a podcast, there should be reasons for it, right? Just like with anything else, you're going to think through it. Does it make sense? Does it financially make sense for your business to do so? What are the opportunity costs if I start a podcast and the amount of time that's invested in that podcast? What am I giving up in order to make that happen? So there are things that you need to think through in order to understand if it actually makes sense. The same is true with your marketing, right? So do I do free and organic marketing or do I pay for advertising? Those are decisions that you need to make for your business, and they're going to be based on time, business goals, budget dollars, resources available to help make those come true, and then track the results. But the reality is that you're not going to jump into any type of marketing, whether it's just putting a profile page on Facebook or investing in Google Ads. The same is true with a podcast. Even though people are saying, and by people, I mean big name influencers, are saying you should jump in and start a podcast. Everybody should have a podcast. The reality is not everyone should have a podcast. So the first thing that I want to walk through is to actually think through whether or not it makes sense. Real quick, when I wanted to start my podcast, and I started my podcast in December of 2018, I actually had been thinking about it for about 6 months. In fact, I had talked to somebody and wanted to bring somebody in with me and do like a co-hosting podcast. The only problem with that is that he kept wavering and wanting to take steps, but then he kept holding back. And I finally decided, yes, I would like to have a co-host, but do I want this indecisiveness and lingering and non-responsive behavior to hold me back from starting a podcast? And I decided to go ahead and launch out on my own. I wanted to make this happen because I felt at the time that it was going to be a good business decision and another way for me to reach my audience. So I started the podcast on my own, and I've been solo ever since. I've had guests, but I've been solo as the host ever since. So I just completed episode number 91, and this is September of 2020. So I've published a lot of episodes religiously every week since I started. So just to kind of give you, some heads up as to why I started, when I started, and kind of the situation. But during that 6 months where I was thinking about it, I walked through, I listened to webinars from Pat Flynn, who was extremely helpful and gave me all of the tools and information I needed to, one, think through it, and then also what I needed to actually make it happen. So that was extremely helpful. And I'll put a link in the description because if you decide that going forward with a podcast does make sense for your business, I highly recommend going through his podcasting webinar. Super helpful. It's free. And then he also has a course that you can go through as well. That's a paid course, but it's super helpful. So I'll include that link in the description below this video. Going back to the reason why I started a podcast and just the whole thought process of it. When I was doing my research and I was watching videos or webinars on how to do this, listening to other people's podcasts, there was a lot of research involved in doing that. The only thing is I really didn't know what I was getting into until I actually got into it. Okay, so that's going to lead me to item number 2 and things that you need to think about before starting a podcast. The biggest thing is that you'll hear 2 sides of this coin. You'll hear people saying, if you're going to start a podcast, just jump in, which I agree. Sometimes you just have to take that step, make it happen, take the first action and put it into motion so that you can get past that obstacle that might be holding you back from starting it to begin with. I totally get that. The thing is that if you just jump in without any thought as to whether or not it makes sense or not for your business and for you, then it could be leading you down a path of a lot of frustration and anxiety and what was I thinking or how can I make this work? And that again requires you to just stop and look to see if it makes sense for your business. So it is very time consuming. Okay, so when you jump in and just make it happen, then that's fine. You can do it and just make it happen. The thing is that if you're not thinking through the entire process and what your goal is and what the format is and how long you want them to be and whether or not you want to have show notes or if you want to have guests or where you want to put it or how you're going to have any actions at the end of each episode, how you're going to do an intro or an outro, how are you going to edit or are you going to edit? Are you going to do any live? Are you going to do them all recorded? There's a lot of things to think through. So Yes, anyone can start a podcast and anyone can just get an account on anchor.fm and make it happen. So if that's your personality, you don't want to think through it and just get it started, then go for it. Nobody's holding you back, right? Just know that the statistic for people starting and stopping a podcast is high. The average number of episodes per podcaster is 7. So if that tells you anything, and there's over like 20 million podcasts today, it's probably higher than that. I haven't looked at that statistic in months, but that was the latest number that I can remember. But still, if you think about just 20 million podcasts available to listen to, and out of those 20 million, the average number of episodes per podcast is 7, that's pretty low, right? So if you look at some of the people who've been doing this for a long time, like Amy Porterfield or Pat Flynn or Lewis Howes or even Gary Vaynerchuk, if you go to any of their podcasts and see how many episodes they have, they've got hundreds. So they've been doing it for obviously a lot longer than I have. I haven't hit triple digits yet, but that'll happen November 23rd, 2020. So it'll happen this year. So you can go through and just see that, yes, they have a plan. They've been doing it consistently and, it's worked out for them. Did they just jump in and make it happen without giving it any thought? I seriously doubt it. They probably put a lot of thought into their strategy and their business and their planning all the time, and the reason why they're so successful. So looking at that side of the equation, jumping in, go for it. Now, if you want to think longer than being an average of 7 episodes per podcast, then I suggest that you sit down and create a strategy. Do the research. Is your target audience going to even listen to a podcast? Especially now with a lot, most people aren't in their cars that often. So where are they listening to podcasts? They might be doing it during yard work. They might do it while they're working. They might do it while they're cooking dinner. There's a lot of different ways that they could listen to podcasts, but the numbers went down over the board during COVID. So that kind of tells you right there that there were fewer people listening, but maybe those numbers went down because more people were creating podcasts at the same time. So just keep that in mind. That's the reason why it's so important to go through and do the research, because you don't want to set yourself up to fail. And you also don't want to set yourself up for frustration, especially during this time when we're already in so many different emotional mindsets with business and our lives and job loss and loss of lives and everything else that goes along with COVID and just the craziness of 2020. So you don't want to set yourself up for failure again, or not again, but you don't want to set yourself up for failure in a situation like this that you can control. And if it doesn't make sense, then don't do it. Look at doing videos on YouTube, or consider starting a blog, or ask your target audience how they best consume information and do the research as to what that information needs to be. There might be a gap in your industry, or just with them. What problems do they have? How can you help solve those problems through a platform like podcasting or videos or blogs or social media? So just go through and do your research, okay? I just highly recommend it. I'm not one to say just jump in without giving it any thought or strategy or intention or objectives or any of that, just like I wouldn't with my business. So that's going to set you up for your best chances of success and getting past that average of 7 episodes for your podcast. Okay, the third thing is, and this is extremely important, again, it goes back to not setting yourself up to fail, is that having a podcast can be very time consuming. It depends, just like with anything else, on the format, whether or not you're going to have guests, the show notes, whether you're going to have them or not. Are you just going to have it on like an anchor.fm where you don't have to do anything else? It's only on that platform and maybe the distribution network that they're associated with. Or are you going to take it to a different level that's going to require more time, more planning, inviting other people, getting audio clips that you can incorporate into your podcast and make it more informative, but then also expand the reach of your podcast? There's a lot of different factors that go into it. And that's the piece that I didn't know when I got into my podcast, is the amount of time that it would take. So I had thought through the initial part of it, of planning. I know this is an area that I want to expand my business. My target audience is listening to podcasts. So the opportunity was there. But the piece that I didn't realize is that I wanted this to be a great piece of content. Like, I wanted it to be a valuable piece of content for whoever listens to it. And one of the things that I had not factored in was the amount of time that it takes to actually publish an episode. Okay, so I'm not the anchor.fm person who's just like, hey, press play, record, done, and I'm on my way to something else. That's not me. So I went with Libsyn, who is the hosting company for my podcast. Libsyn is the WordPress to websites, so making that comparison. So Libsyn, I chose them based on a webinar and research and just different people who were using them, recommendations, and that was just the one that worked best for me. Love the platform and super easy to use. So I went ahead and went with them. They've got a good distribution network. The thing is that you have to plan out ahead of time the accounts that you need to create and where you want your podcast to be published. So an example, if you listen to webinars, especially Pat Flynn's, you will hear him say that you need to set up your Apple ID first. Now, if you're an Apple user, you probably already have one, but I'm an Android user, so I needed to set up my Apple ID. And the time frame for Apple approving a podcast on their system can take up to 14 days. It might be different than when I started mine, but at the time it could take up to 14 days. So if I had wanted to publish my podcast in December of 2018, let's just say it was December 1st, 2018, and I hadn't taken that into consideration, well, now that's put me back possibly 2 weeks, right? So I needed to factor that component into the overall planning and when I wanted that first one to publish. So, and then once you do it on Apple, you have to create accounts on other platforms as well, like Google Podcasts, Spotify. There's other ones as well that you have to create ahead of time, and then you enter those into Libsyn, and then they push it out when each episode publishes. So just things that you have to keep in mind. And those were things that I hadn't thought about time-wise, what was going to be required in order to launch in the time frame that I wanted to. So, and then I thought, okay, that's great. I've got my podcast out on these platforms. Now, what do I want the content or the user experience to be? Do I want it just to be audio? Do I want to leverage this as an opportunity to create show notes, which might also help with SEO, driving traffic to my website? Do I want to have any type of downloadable documents? If I'm talking about identifying your personas or creating your ideal customer avatar, do I want to provide any type of documents to help people actually do that? So I'm the kind of person who wants to think through all the different aspects and then provide as much value as I can. If I'm fortunate enough to have your time to listen to my content, then I want to make it worth your time. Like, I want to give you as much information that's going to be helpful to that topic that I can at that moment. So that's what I wanted to do. So I went a little bit above and beyond just the record and move on path. But again, that was my choice. That's what I wanted to do. And I was also looking at opportunities to cross-link within my website. So I was looking at SEO opportunities. And then if I did a guest interview, having a video and having that video embedded on my website. So there were different things that I was thinking through in regards to the user experience and the content and the format that my target audience consumes information. So that was a lot of time. But then when you think about all of those different aspects, I'm not only just recording the podcast, let's just say I have a guest, because those are going to be the ones that are most time consuming. I have to invite the guest. I have to plan the guest. I have to record the video. Then I have to record an intro and an outro. If you want to have music to it, then you have to get the music. You need your podcast cover. You change that so that you've got that person on your podcast cover. You do any editing that you need to. You separate the video from the audio so you can upload the audio to your podcast. You've got to do show notes. If you want to have a downloadable document, you need to create that, link to it. Do you want to have it open so anybody can download it, or do you want to have it gated so you can collect email addresses? And then I need to publish it, and then I need to communicate, and then I need to have the marketing plan. So now how am I going to get it out to people? And then what's that plan going to look like? Am I going to put everything out there on one day, or am I going to distribute it throughout the week that episode publishes? And then you look at, repurposing that content. How else can I use this content? Do I want to do audio clips? Do I want to do video clips? Do I want to just do text clips? Do I want to capture user reviews? And do I want to do that on the website, or do I want to do it on the separate platforms? I mean, obviously that was a very quick, high-level overview of the process, but that was pretty thorough. And I'll share my checklist with you in the description as well. So if you're interested in that, you're more than welcome to have it. Obviously, there's other people who are more high visible. They have a higher visibility than I do and a lot more subscribers than I do. But if you're open to using mine, you're more than welcome to do that. So I will include that link below. But it's something that's extremely time consuming, and that was something I hadn't planned on. So when you think, okay, I think it's only going to take like maybe an hour. Okay, that was really underestimating the amount of time that it takes. I mean, it can take me like a full 6 to 8 hours for doing all the editing and doing all the show notes, and the marketing's completely outside of that. That's just the episode itself if it's video and if I have a guest. So, and then of course, if I'm having a guest, I don't want to not promote them, right? That's the point. You have them on there. You want them to help you and promote your podcast, but you also want to help in promoting them. So there's just a lot of time involved. So again, you don't want to set yourself up to fail. So being realistic about what you're getting yourself into is better than just jumping in and making it happen. Where you can do the jumping in and making it happen is once you've done that thinking through, right? So you've decided, yes, I want to do a podcast. You've researched, you looked into how you're going to make it happen, your format, all of those things that I've just gone through. And you've said, yes, this makes sense for me, my business, my target audience, and the goals I'm trying to achieve. Great. That is awesome, because you've gotten to that point that's most important. It makes sense for your business. It makes sense for you. It makes sense for your target audience. That's the best thing that you could do. So now that you've gotten to that point, that's where some people may not actually press go. So that's where a lot of people get stuck, because then it's like, oh my gosh, what have I done? Do I want to continue moving forward? There's these doubts. And just like with anything else, when you're starting something new, there's hesitation, and it's understandable. But that's the point when you've done the research, you've already said, yes, it makes sense for my business. That's when you want to just jump in and make it happen. So that's the part that you want to actually just not think about doing and not overthink it, because if you do that, you're not going to actually do it. The thing that I would do differently, connect the dots is not most visible in business. It's not most visible in marketing. It's not most visible in marketing or sales. And that's what connect the dots is. Connect the dots is about connecting the dots between marketing and sales in your business. Knowing that, I had to explain what connect the dots was, right? You can't glean from connect the dots what it's about, who it's for, or what you can get from it. So that would be one thing that I would do differently. And one thing I would tell you to think through up front is, what is the title of your podcast and why does it matter? So I was being clever and thinking, because you hear connect the dots in all kinds of conversations. It doesn't matter who it is. Whenever I hear it, I kind of like, my ears perk up, because I'm like, hey, they just said connect the dots. It's very common, but naming my podcast just Connect the Dots was missing the component that was most critical, and that was marketing, strategic marketing, marketing for B2B businesses, marketing to help grow your revenue. There's pieces that were missing. So when you're naming your podcast, think through the name and whether or not someone's going to know immediately from the title what it's about and if they should listen to it. Also, the other piece that I will mention, I've learned this from Pat Flynn recently on one of his live shows that he's doing, the income stream. And he had mentioned through his podcast that, or it was an episode on podcasting, and he had mentioned that podcast platforms and even like Google are starting to pay more attention to SEO and how that relates to podcast descriptions. That's really hard for me to say. So that's just something to think about too. So now, of course, I'm 91 episodes in. I'm starting to hear this. And I'm like, oh my gosh, what have I been doing up to this point that is or isn't going to have an impact on SEO? Like I knew at some point that it would, but was I putting all of my effort into making sure that my titles and my descriptions and everything associated with each episode was focused on whether or not it was SEO related? No, it wasn't. The show notes had some of that included, but it was not part of my thought process when I was creating the titles for each of my episodes. So look at the two things I would say to make sure that you do, and these were things that now, 91 episodes in on Connect the Dots, I should have paid attention to and done differently, are the podcast name. And when you start doing your podcast episodes, whichever path you take, just think what impact you want that to have on SEO if your format and how you move forward with it is going to be along the lines of attracting, Google search and voice search and how people are searching. So, are you ready to start your podcast? The first answer should have been, I need to research it and see if it makes sense for my business. That's all I recommend. Just stop, think, decide if it makes sense for you, your business, and your objectives. That's all I'm saying. So before jumping in and saying, yes, I should start a podcast because so-and-so said I should start a podcast, make sure that you stop and see if it actually makes sense for you. Okay? Awesome. Well, thank you so much for joining me today. Again, I'm Vicki O'Neill, your Plateau to Grow marketer. If you are new here, thank you so much for joining me. Don't forget to hit subscribe and the bell notification so you'll see it in your list of notifications when you log into YouTube. Or if you have your notifications turned on your phone, you'll see it there as well. I also go live every Wednesday at 12 p.m. Eastern Standard Time. So if you're interested in marketing related topics and are interested in joining my community, I am doing the marketing stream on YouTube live every Wednesday at 12 p.m. Eastern Standard Time. I would love to have you there. So again, thank you so much for being here. Don't forget to hit like, leave a comment if you have any questions, or if you need anything else, I'd be more than happy to help however I can. Again, keep in mind, I am not the top podcasting guru, but my experiences can hopefully help you either make the decision to move forward, not move forward, or if you do move forward, hopefully you can learn from my experiences as well. Okay, thanks again for joining me. Until next time, make today great.